Good evening. Good evening. Welcome along. Time for another Inspire and Be Inspired, weekly motivational conversations, occasional life hacks. Tonight we are all about the music. It's great to have you with us. If you're watching live, then please feel free to leave any comments, ask any questions, and the same goes for everybody watching the recording. It's nice to have your company. It is Tuesday, the 7th of June. I am here broadcasting live and direct from the Costa Blanca, 7 p.m. 6 o'clock for most of our friends back in the UK. This evening, I am extremely excited to welcome a guest along. He's about to come on the next screen. A gentleman who I was introduced to, you may recall, a few months ago now, I interviewed Edsy and Winston Hazel. We were talking about the Sheffield and Bradford scene, and Edsy from Unique 3 recommended that I talk to a gentleman by the name of Matt Anniss. He said there's a book that I need to read that tells all about the history of the scene up north. And I said, I think I've read enough books for now. But he insisted, he said it would be a good idea. So I spent my hard-earned money and I went to Amazon and I picked this up. Join the Future, Bleep Techno and the Birth of British Bass Music. And I have to say, I'm so thoroughly glad that I did, because this book right here, it put together a lot of pieces of the jigsaw in my battered brain. It told the story of the birth of the rave scene, so to speak, and it went back even before then. So it's going to be my pleasure to bring along Mr. Matt Anniss onto the screen. How are you, sir? Welcome along.
I'm very good, thank you, Andy, and thanks so much for asking me to do this. I'm a big fan of what you've been doing with these streams and your enthusiasm for trying to document forgotten aspects of British dance music culture, particularly in and around your home city of Birmingham.
Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, let me talk very briefly about my journey and the passion for documenting. And then I'm going to hand over the floor to yourself, because it is all about the words from yourself tonight. Before we do that, let me say hi to Mr. Deli G, who you'll be more than familiar with, who is watching. He sends his love. How you going, Deli? Bristol man, and someone who is definitely firmly placed in the history of music in the south of England. So yeah,
big ups, Delhi. Sorry to butt in, but yeah, big ups to Delhi. And oops, I shouldn't knock the desk. And apologies as well to him. I probably still owe him a bio, but that's we'll come back to that.
No worries. Martin Bailey, good evening, sir. Also, Mr. John Rogers. While I'm talking, Matt, I try to make this as interactive as I can, because we'd like to make the people feel welcome. But once we get into the conversation, I will be paying attention to their comments, but I shan't be interrupting you. So let me get back to where it all began for me. I simply enjoyed documenting the story. We had the series Brum as Fuck, where I was talking to a lot of my friends that I've got to know down the years, and it was pretty much a selfish task, really, trying to remember, trying to piece together all of the details regarding my early clubbing days, why I couldn't remember things, and just to, get the story straight from different perspectives, something which we will touch on eventually. And what I found more and more as I spoke to people, of course, on the house scene, that we would roll back and talk about the birth of the house scene, and then we would start talking about the Ordeas in Birmingham, and then that would bring up the matter of us travelling up and down the country on the coaches, and so on and so forth. And because I am aware of the history, it then led me to talk to other people. After talking to Edsy, and he recommended me read your book, I read this book again. I cannot commend you enough on the incredible work that you did. So before we get to talk about the book, I guess really I should allow you to introduce yourself and tell us who is Matt and what is it that Matt does.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm a long-serving veteran dance music journalist. I used to be the editor of a magazine called IDJ back in the sort of mid-2000s. Was there for 8 years. After that, I freelanced. Since then, I've been freelancing. But I guess over the last few years, I've begun to specialise really in sort of historic aspects of UK dance music culture, because cultural and social history really interests me, and particularly the fact that so much of UK dance music history isn't really documented particularly well. Now, I'm sure that's something that we can touch on a bit more later in terms of why that may be and what we can do about it. But I'm also now a part-time PhD student. I'm doing research into rave culture in East Anglia, of all places, which is a little bit different to Journey Future and the things that I've written about before. But again, that's just an extension of enjoying the process of doing research and speaking to people. And although academic research is a bit different because it's about perspectives and linking it in with existing work, so it's not really about storytelling in the same way as the journalism or writing a book. It's I'm really enjoying that. It's hard work, though, to kind of go back to university after God knows how many years it is since I did my journalism degree. Wow. 20-something. Wait a minute. We think about it. 1996 I started. So what's that, 26 years?
It's interesting to hear you talk about that, because I've had someone badgering me talking about I should look into something like that myself with all the research that I'm doing. But the truth be told, I do very little research. I just bring my friends on, I talk to them, I get the different perspectives, and sometimes I think that is the most authentic way. For a project of this nature, of course, when you then start putting it down onto paper, you have to be a little bit more thorough, I think is the word, which will bring us to the book, talking about thorough, a labour of love. Tell us how long you put your blood, sweat and tears into it.
Well, the original idea for it, or the main proposition, which was bleep and bass, was far more important than in terms of the development of UK dance music than people had previously given it credit for. That kind of came out of an argument I had in a club it must be about 2009, maybe, something like that. It's a long time ago now. And that was with some young DJs. I was playing in the second room of a club called Timbuktu, and they were playing in the main room. And while they weren't playing, they came around to listen to what was playing. And I played quite a bit of Bleep in that set. And they were kind of going, "Oh, what's this? Never heard this music. What is it? What's this record?" And I went, "Well, it's LFO, or something, similarly big." And they said, "Well, what type of music is it?" And I said, "Well, it's bleep and bass." And they said, "Well, what's that then?" And I said, "Well, it was the blueprint for UK bass music." And they went, "No, everybody knows it started with hardcore." And I went, "No, Unique Three's a thing was first, and there was all these other things going on." Not that I knew that much about it at the time, but for whatever reason, had come to this, maybe not conclusion, but I'd had this germ of an idea. And then I kept kind of returning to that. It kept coming back into my mind for some reason, while I was doing all sorts of other freelance jobs. At that point, I wasn't writing that much about music. I was doing these kind of short non-fiction books for kids that go in school libraries, and bizarrely writing about triathlon.
Right, okay.
And then I think it was... I think 2013, I went to the then editor of Resident Advisor and said, I've got this idea for an article which looks at basically Bleep being this kind of hidden style that nobody really talks about, that was more important, and it was Britain's first kind of bass. In terms of dance music, I know there were other things like Lovers Rock, which you could argue was a Black British invention, that preceded it, and Brit Funk, I guess, as well. But in terms of a kind of style of house or techno, something heavily electronic, that was Bleep. So from that point, I kind of started. I did the few interviews for the feature, got the kind of spoke to people like Winston Hazel.
So just to interject, stating the very obvious to you and I now, you may be surprised that the actual term bleep and bass was something that I either never heard before or I had long since forgotten in the last 20 years. Because when I read your book, I was thinking, why does this phrase not ring familiar to me? I was baffled because I was there at the very beginning. So you're talking about records like LFO. Before that, of course, Unique Threes, The Theme, and a lot of the music from the Sheffield area. So I just wanted
and Leeds as well, of course, Bradford. And there was Huddersfield was also important to the story, as you know, with all the stuff around Sunset Boulevard and as a club and as a kind of meeting place. But again, when I started, I didn't know any of this. It took, because it hadn't really been, I think I managed to find maybe a couple of articles online. There was one from Simon Reynolds, who wrote Energy Flash, talking about what he thought were, I don't know, 10 or 15 or 20 important Bleep records. And that was kind of about it, really. It just astonished me that nobody was talking about this. Bleep and bass is a term. I chose to use that more in the book than bleep techno because it's kind of not really techno. To call it techno is maybe a bit inaccurate. It kind of is. It was heavily influenced by techno, but it was also more influenced by electro and the house music of the period as well. So and also it's not really about the bleeps. The important thing in it is the bass, I think, I would argue.
Well, that's it. So we're not going to cover all of your years of work of research in this short interview, and I will definitely recommend that people purchase this book and read it because it is incredible. But what it does do, it does piece together a lot of the pieces of the jigsaw. But as I said, you roll back, you actually get to that point, and then so tell us about the process of why you felt that was necessary. Did you always intend to do that, or did you get to a point where you thought, hold on a minute, this is unraveling further back than I expected?
Well, that came out of the research process. I noticed originally when I did the RA feature, which I think 2013 or 2014, that so many of these people I was interviewing talked about breakdancing and electro and the soul all day scene and that being important. So I thought, well, okay, I've got to at least go back to that. And then I started thinking, actually, you can't really tell a story without, I don't think anyway, properly, without contextualizing it and saying, this is what was happening at the time beforehand, because nothing emerges in isolation. If you just started from, say, the theme and told the story, I mean, it could have been a very different book. It could have been just the story told through 20 records, but it would have been a worse book, I think, because the context is important, because it allows you to, or at least that was what I was trying to do, is allow people to understand that there was all this activity in the UK, and particularly in the Midlands and the north of England, but also places like Bristol and London had lots happening that hasn't been documented, as well as the stuff that has. All this stuff that was happening beforehand that fed into it, and without those things happening, the sound probably wouldn't have emerged at the time it did and the way it did.
So it was all very organic up and down the country, spread, of course, by the travelling ravers, so to speak. But there must have been something in the air for it to, so many coincidences. Do you believe in coincidences, or do you think everything is extrinsically linked?
Well, that's a very deep philosophical question. I think it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to see the connections 30 years on when you do the research. At the time, not necessarily. I mean, I remember there's a guy in the book called Homer Harriott who was the sort of production partner of a guy called DJ Martin. He was one of the founder members of LFO and a really pivotal figure in Leeds. And I remember him saying, after he read the book, he said, I had no idea at the time that all of these other things were happening, because we were so kind of in our bubble and that we didn't realise that there was something wider happening. So I
Well,
guess
that's
it's a
what I
lot
think.
easier to create, and you have to be careful in terms of creating narratives. I mean, history itself there's no one history, there's no true history. It's a plurality of histories, and you can look at things in different ways. I was so kind of sure when I was writing the book that my argument was strong, but I still worry that it's weak, or you could look at it in different ways. It's just kind of one argument and one admittedly exhaustively researched way of looking at events. Other things are happening in other parts of the country that are equally important, that are equally valid, that still need documenting or still need writing about, because those people deserve credit. And that's the other important thing for me. The more I got into it, the more I realized I was just somebody who had been given the opportunity to tell other people's stories. It's not about me. I've written the book, but it's not my story. It's the story of all those people that, like Edsy and Winston and Martin and Homer and, all the other people featured in the book, who were there doing these things that they weren't really given much credit for in most cases at the time.
Well, you did an incredible job.
And deserve enormous credit for.
You did an absolutely incredible job, as I say, blown away by it. And I do need to go back and read it again, actually, because I raced through it, really raced through it. I was really, and then as it started moving through the year. So I just want to say hi again to a few people that are joining us. Hi to Alex, hi to Emily, and we say a very special hi to a young lady by the name of Prue, who you may be aware of.
Yes, I haven't seen Prue in many years, but I'm sure our paths will cross again at some point.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here. As I do say, we're going to be deep in conversation. This chat will roll and roll, so please do stick around. If you have to jump off, then do come back and check out the recording, because we're going to be covering a lot of different topics. Matt is a fountain of knowledge, and I'll do my very best to extract some of that out of him for you. So yeah, thank you for being here. Good evening, Cliff, as well. I just saw your message. The book, how do you feel that looking back on it now, are you clearly you're very proud of the work. Would you do anything slightly differently if you had the opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I think you always learn, don't you, as you go along, in terms of how you can not streamline the process. When I started it, although I'd obviously been a journalist for a long time and I've written articles and I kind of researched articles, I didn't really have any idea what you needed to do to sort of to write a book that was kind of accurate, or as accurate as it can be, and sort of detailed and told a story. There were several times over the years when people said to me, "Surely you've got enough material now," and I'd be going, "No, there's more. There's more. There's more I need to find out." And actually, there is an updated, revised edition that's going to be coming out. Might be later this year, might be early next year. We're not quite sure just yet. But that will have a bit more stuff in it, and the typos that are in there will go, that we managed to miss when we're doing the copy editing. And there'll be one or two other new interviews as well with people that I've spoken to kind of since the book came out. People like Richie Horton, for example.
Is that difficult, though, not to allow yourself to sneak little bits in, because the work is the work as it is? And as you say, where do you draw the line? Because otherwise then wouldn't you go for part two, for example?
Well, there is going to be an entirely different book as well, that my publisher has kind of commissioned, which I can't say too much about just now, but that's going to be looking at UK dance music history in a kind of a wider way, but it'll probably be, because it's me and because of my obsessions, it will probably be an alternative history. So it'll focus a lot on things like regional scenes that haven't, records that were big on regional scenes that haven't really been talked about much, and, styles of music that maybe personally I don't like that much, but I can see, there were vibrant music communities there. So something like happy hardcore, say, or Scouse House or something like that,
Right.
because those aren't things that interest me in terms of the music. I'm not a fan of those, but I think it's important as a researcher and a cultural historian to be able to look and go, okay, that was really important to this set of people. And although I don't like the music, that's equally valid. I mean, that was something that somebody that Prue, who's tuned in, will know. There's a good friend of mine who used to be editor of IDJ, a guy called Russell Deeks. And while I was in IDJ, he sort of deliberately taught me a lesson when he sent me up to Rotherham to do a feature on tidy tracks. And I was kind of young and, I don't know, had the arrogance of youth and pretty militant, and went, why are you sending me here? This music's rubbish. I hate it. And actually what I found when I went up there was actually there was this really dedicated community within Hard House and people who surrounding the label. And, that's a great story in itself. Just because I'm not interested in the music doesn't mean that it's not valid, So that's the thing to do. Sorry, I've gone off the point here.
No, fine. We were talking about
for the first time this evening.
No, that's fine. So we were talking, and you saying that there may be another publication coming out. At which point, I will say a huge shout out to the guys at Velocity Press, because there's been quite a few books I've read since this. You got me. I used to read a lot, and then I stopped. But this was the catalyst to start me back down the rabbit hole, so to speak. And since then, I've been reading a few other books that we may get to talk about a little later on.
Yeah, but, Colin at Velocity Press definitely needs a shout out. I mean, when he approached me originally, actually, not about Join the Future, because he had no idea I was working on that. He just sort of asked, I think he was looking for people possibly to ghostwrite sort of DJ autobiographies, because he'd had this idea of setting up Velocity Press. And having a book publisher that was just dedicated to books about electronic music and club culture. And to be honest, that's a brilliant idea, because part of I would argue that until Velocity Press came along, there was probably a deficit in terms of the volume of books about dance music, in part because bigger publishers think it's too niche. That they only bigger publishers will go, we need to sell X amount, whether it's 20,000 or 30,000, whatever it may be, to get their money back. And there are very few books about dance music without insane amounts of marketing that would be able to sell that many. So hence you always get kind of the same rehashes of The Second Summer of Love, where it features Paul Oakenfold and Danny Rampling again for the 900th time, or you get, books about Daft Punk or something. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. I know some people are writing books about.
That'll bring us on. That'll bring us on to the point then that we will eventually have to address of history being seen through different eyes. We had the conversation that history. Am I phrasing it correct? That history can be subjective depending on the perspective that you're looking at it.
Yeah, it's complicated because, can be viewed through. I mean, history traditionally, if you look at kind of the ways that academic historians approach it, there tend to be different perspectives, don't there? So some historians are revisionists. Some, people will probably say that I was a revisionist, because what I do is go and kind of go, okay, this is the narrative you've been told. Actually, there's also this alternative narrative, and you can make an argument this is equally, if not more important. But that's an argument. Where it becomes difficult with dance music is that dance music only had traditionally, back in the period where it started booming in the UK, so in the kind of 80s and 90s, it only had a relatively limited amount of media outlets. So you kind of got what was covered in those at the time is kind of what's been documented. And that's, at the time, that's down to the selection of music journalists. So while jungle was becoming a massive thing at the grassroots, you had Mix Mag banging on about progressive house, as an example. Whereas we look back now, and no offense to progressive house, because it's valid enough and lots of people love it, you could argue that jungle was probably more revolutionary in terms of what it did and what happened afterwards than progressive house, which was kind of maybe a bit of a dead end to a certain extent. So that's a problem. But it's also a problem that a lot of mainstream representations of dance music history, particularly in the UK, tend to kind of just rely on a few sort of foundational books. So things like Altered State by Matthew Collin, which is a brilliant book, and Cheryl Garrett's Adventures in Wonderland, and Energy Flash, I guess, by Simon Reynolds. And they're all great books in their own way. But there is kind of this focus within them on, as you know, that it was different because you were in the, growing up in the Midlands at the time. But this idea that sort of the acid house or whatever developed in a certain way. Now that was a narrative that was there kind of from the start because these people got media coverage. And then when people go back and look at it, sort of 10, 15, 20 years later, they just repeat it. And the more something is repeated, the more it becomes in the wider public consciousness thought of as fact or the story. Whereas history is messy and lots of different things are happening at the same time. It's a bit like saying that in Bristol it was always all about a kind of mixture of reggae, hip hop, and later drum and bass and jungle and dubstep and trip hop and blah blah blah. Whereas in fact there were always people like Delhi. We'll go back to who were playing house music. So
let's. You mentioned about Delhi and the history. Let's go back very briefly then to because you said you wanted to talk about the importance of the sound system culture on the UK house music scene, particularly in the north, the funk scene. You drew some great references to particularly the reggae scene and the funk scene and the black community and the differences of people going out to dance. Where you have to forgive me. Do you recall you made a very valid point about that the black guys would go out, they would be challenging on the dance floor because it was part of their culture, whereas the scene progressed differently in other communities. I'm correct in assuming those were your words, right?
Yeah, as a summary, it's probably a lot more wordy and lengthy in the book, but that's basically
forgive me for slaughtering your incredible
key argument, isn't it? I think it's there's been a few books and articles and things over the last few years that have kind of reappraised the importance of sound system culture. And it was vitally important to the way that certainly house and techno in the UK developed in certain places. And other forms of dance music, actually. It's just, it just seems, look, in hindsight now, it just seems it's quite obvious. But I guess at the time, bar a few articles, I mean, there was an article I think I referenced in the book from Matthew Collin when he was working at ID magazine sometime in the spring of 1990, basically saying this summer, the sound of UK dance music is going to be really reggae and dub influenced. And if you play, I think it was the Forge Masters remix of Man Machine at 33 rather than 45, what you get is a dub record. And if you try that, he's right. Exactly but he'd also identified, he talks in that feature as well about Smith and Mighty in Bristol and Massive Attack and what was happening with I guess like Soul to Soul in London and the early breakbeat hardcore scene and so on. So it was there at the time. It was just, I was quite pleasantly surprised to find that when I was at the British Library doing the research, looking through old magazines. But up until that point, I just assumed that people hadn't talked about it at the time. But of course they had. People had noticed. It's just for whatever reason, it just hadn't become part of the kind of mainstream narrative over the years that followed.
Front Back House says good evening, watching on YouTube. Hi there. Mr. Milford, good evening, sir. He says he's done a lot of research into acid house in the last 10 years. The whole thing about Rampling and Oki is a little bit of a fairy tale. The scene was already there. It's just their nights that got boosted into the media. A lot of stuff happening way before. So we talk about that.
This is true. And actually, I managed to really irritate Cheryl Garrett. Who because I did a piece for DJ Mag a couple of years ago after the book came out, which questioned how much UK dance music history is real. And when I contacted Cheryl to interview her and kind of said more or less in a roundabout way, why did you put this forward when it that's not correct? She got quite irritated with me, to be honest. And actually, if you look at her first ever report of Shoom that she did for The Face, I think, actually she says in there, London gets acid house a year after the Midlands and the North. So she kind of knew at the time. So I said, well, how come then, if you knew that, you know, in your writing and your work over the years, you've consistently put forward the kind of Ibiza origin myth, you know, with Rampling and Oakenfold and so on. And she said they made themselves available for interview at the time, and it was a good story. And that annoyed me. I said, it's a good story, but it's not an accurate story. So you're misleading people. And I've got a lot of respect for her. She's a brilliant journalist and a real pioneer in terms of, she was one of the few people writing about club culture in the UK in that period of time, and one of the few female journalists writing about dance music for a long period of time. So, you know, full respect to her, but I don't agree with her about that at all.
I hear that. So it's 18 months, it was stated, both on piecing the words from your book, also from Dreaming in Yellow, the DIY book. I might be getting where I've got the information from incorrect in my head. As I say, not one to do a lot of research, forgive me. Was it yourself that was talking about the dressers from up north who were there already in Ibiza?
Yes, and that was something that came from
scallies, so to speak.
Yeah, that was something that came from partly from Luke Unabomber, but he kind of did also Luke Unit, as he's known now. And he did. Luke obviously was there, kind of on the dance floor, and he was a bit of a football hooligan, and you know, somebody who was at Jolly Turkey in Sheffield a lot, and you know, he tells a story in the book about seeing this Blades business crew hooligan firm member. I can't remember what he referred to him as. We might have left some of the names of the different people for obvious reasons are left out of the book because they're still alive. The ones that are no longer here are in there. And he talks about seeing this guy basically dressed in what was considered later that kind of Balearic sort of outfit. From kind of, I guess, 87, 88 onwards, as early as 1985. And these were guys who were going over to Ibiza. Now, it wasn't just these guys from Sheffield. There were people from the Midlands, you know, certainly from the East Midlands. I don't know about Birmingham because I never asked, and some from Manchester as well. So yeah, there were people going over, and these were kind of international grifters, I suppose you'd call them, sneak thieves. There were people that sort of
what do you call them? Grifters,
months on the run.
Grafters, we call them.
Grafters, yeah, exactly. The sort of 80s football hooligan version of, I don't know, those kind of Nigel Farage-ish social media people who kind of just say outlandish things for money to get a raise. But anyway, we won't get into politics. That's something different. But yeah,
influencers, 80s influencers,
80s influence, yeah, influence on the floor. But yeah, it's certainly true that there were, and he said to me before we did the interview, he went and checked with some of the people down south, like Nancy Noyes, to kind of go, can I talk about this? You know, can I say that you would confirm this sort of thing? So, I mean, that in itself is I think is a kind of it would have got more coverage, and I would have dug more into that if the book had been different. But it wasn't really about that. It was just an interesting kind of aside that fed into the story and kind of contested that false narrative. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to contest a narrative, you have to put evidence, counter evidence. It can't just be your opinion. And I've learned over the years that a lot of the opinions that I held when I was younger, are wrong, or were a bit misleading, or I was a bit misguided. I don't mean political opinions. I just mean in terms of what I believed about maybe certain.
So when you have so many different characters involved in the story from different neighborhoods, and people have different recollections, and of course you're talking about a time where people weren't necessarily completely with it a lot of the time, let's put it mildly. Did you find that you came across a lot of issues with conflicting stories and conflicting accounts of the same incident?
Actually, there were one or two, sure. I think where the problems emerge are where people have subsequently fallen out. So when people are, there's always going to be some conflicts, because any creative endeavor, there's going to be egos, aren't there? Mm-hmm. And some people, a good example would be, I have a lot of time for Jez Farley. And Jez, to be fair to him, when I first contacted him, did mention Martin and did DJ Martin and did give him credit, but he kind of wasn't really sure what had happened to him. He didn't really talk that much about it. When I then subsequently spoke to Martin and interviewed him, and Martin said X, Y, and Z, I then went back to Jez and went, okay, this is what Martin says. How much of this is accurate? What's your take on this? And to be fair to Jez, he was then very open and said, actually, that's correct. That's how it happened. Or, if there was a conflict. Then I guess the biggest one in the book, which you can't really get round, is the kind of who had the idea to found Warp, and the kind of what exactly happened about Rob Gordon being given the being sort of removed from the Warp board and thrown out. And
which you kind of skirted around.
I kind of skirt around. Now, I chose there to kind of go, okay, well, it doesn't really matter what I believe or who I choose to believe. They've all got conflicting stories, so I will present what these differing accounts, and people can draw their own conclusions. I think you could probably read between the lines in some of the other things that I say in the book. Mm-hmm. And I had to try and kind of detach myself a bit from it, because I got very frustrated that Steve Beckett, who's the sort of other, aside from Rob Gordon, the other remaining Warp founder, just for whatever reason, just wouldn't talk to me. He just, I tried multiple times over years to get interviews with him, asked people like Winston, who obviously have an existing relationship with him, to go, this guy is sound, you should talk to him. For whatever reason, he just didn't want to do it. So, I found old interviews that he'd given, put those in, contrasted those with what Rob says, and that's it. You can't. It is impossible to know, particularly when there's not a lot of written document. A lot of traditional history, you would kind of go, these are the documents that exist, whether that's film footage, television programs, writing, audio recordings of interviews, whatever they may be, flyers, posters, old publications, magazines, newspapers, all that stuff. When it comes to dance music, and particularly aspects of dance music that weren't documented that well in the first place, then you've got an issue. And that's one of the issues that the people in Chicago, I think, are finding now, in terms of telling the history of house music there and the early years.
Don't even ask what the very first house record was. Oh
yeah, and and I managed to accidentally, put my foot in it. But there was a piece I wrote for RBMA when that was going, Red Bull Music Academy Daily, which was about the kind of proto house or pre-house sound in New York. Now, my argument in there wasn't that this was the birth of house music, because it wasn't, because house was a Chicago construct, but it was a similar kind of movement that was slightly different musically, but had some of the same inspirations, but also had a bit more of the sound system culture influence, because some of the people involved had, even though they were Americans, had Caribbean heritage. Now, the headline for it that I didn't write said "The Birth of House Music in NYC," You can imagine how well that went down in Chicago.
Dear, oh dear.
And Glenn Underground posted on Facebook and called me a know-nothing white kid, which was nice of him. And to be fair, to be called a kid at 40 years of age or whatever I was then, I was okay with that. That's fine.
No,
but,
well, I'll stand in your corner. I'll stand your corner for you.
But again, I ended up got asked to go on a Chicago House podcast run by some guy called Vernal Bird, I think. It's called the Bird's Nest podcast. And they contacted me on the back of this because it turns out that people that were big fans of Larry Levan and the Paradise Garage were using this article to go away, Chicagans, we invented house, which I don't say at all in the piece if you read it. But again, people don't bother in the social media age reading the article. They just read the headline and get outraged by it.
Clickbait.
So I said to these guys, look, I'll talk to you, but please read the feature first, then we'll have a conversation. And to be fair, they then came back to me and went, actually, we can see what you're saying. Yeah, this is, but we'd still like you to come on. And one of the things they said in that, because I said, obviously, from our perspective, as Brits, we know the story of house in Chicago secondhand. But I'm not sure that Chicago has done that good a job at documenting it properly, partly because, what they said to me was basically there's all these arguments, all these people with egos arguing, saying, I was first, I was first, I was first. And to some people, that's important. You always have to be, as a historian, you have to be really, I guess, cautious and careful about that, because there are some people that you interview who will inflate their importance.
They've got ulterior motives. Well, let me say, since we've been talking, we've sold one book, so if nothing else, it's worth it.
Cracking.
Andrew Milford's just jumped onto Amazon and got it. Frontback House says he needs this book, definitely.
What I would say is the best place to buy it isn't Amazon, it's velocitypress.uk, because that means the publisher and me get more money. And he sends them out next day. And he's a lovely fellow. He'll give you some free bookmarks like these ones I'm going to as well, which here we go. Ta-da.
Yes. Wonderful.
Which are advertising other books.
There you go. Definitely get it. Andrew's bought it now. We'll get him a coffee, don't worry. Respect for getting it though. What I was going to say was, since lockdown, and we'll talk about this ever so very briefly, and then we'll come back to you. Lenny Fontana has started his True House Stories. Have you seen any of those interviews? They're incredible.
Bits of them, yeah. And again, that's a great thing. I think there's with what he's doing and what you're doing. And, I've been contacted as well by people who've said, I've read your book, I'm from Nottingham, it's really inspired me to go out and see if I can document, what happened in Nottingham. And anytime anybody comes to me and says that, I say brilliant, because we need more of that. It's what academics, I guess, would call sort of DIY preservation projects, where it's, so they're not authorised. People just do them off their own back and celebrate and mark the history that way, and that's great, because it's there's only so many journalists, and journalists sometimes think, or filmmakers or whatever, sometimes think in commercial terms. I didn't with Join the Future. I was just got a bit obsessed and had this burning fire sort of within me to go, this is really important and people should know it. Whether it is important or not, other people can decide. But I thought it was at the time, and still do. But it doesn't have to have a book at the end of it. It could be, stuff like this, online streams where it's conversations that go into an archive, or it could be a website, a blog, it could be a self-created pamphlet, could be all sorts of different things. It could be something like the Laps Club of Manchester, which started out as an academic project, but that came about, was driven, I think, by an academic called Bleep Peter, and she was finding in her interviews with participants that, or what they would call participants, interviewees, that they were really irritated that all you ever heard about in terms of Manchester dance music was the Hacienda, whereas there are all these other clubs and all these other things that are happening, and places like the Thunderdome and the Blues in Russia, and all these places and these warehouse parties and alternative clubs that they used to go to that weren't marked. So the Laps Clubber Map is basically, it's an online geolocation sort of heritage thing, where basically if you've got a memory, you can go onto the website, you can put a pin in the map, and you can record it or write it down and submit it. They'll overlook it just to make sure it, doesn't mention any criminality or anything that could get anybody into trouble. And then it will go up. So if you go to that website, if you just search for the Laps Clubber map of Greater Manchester, it's got all these incredible memories from people.
Lapse.
Lapsed, lapsed, yeah, Clubber map
Clubber
of Greater Manchester, and there's all sorts of memories in there. Some are more detailed than others, but it's basically allowing people to basically tell their own history or to share memories that are important to them. And that's the thing, because dance music culture and clubbing, going out dancing, DJing, whatever it may be, initially you get into it, don't you? Usually, not always, but usually when you're quite young, a kind of when your identity and you as a person, your identity is being formed. It means that those end up being really important memories that you carry with you for a long time, and experiences that mean a lot. We can all remember as DJs, when we played a certain record for the first time and it went off, or when it dived, it didn't go off, or I managed to clear the room with whatever, as an example. Or you played it when the sun was coming up and you were playing outdoors somewhere. All of these things as memories are important, but they're very personal. But by collecting a lot of them together, you can get a picture of what Beat Peter would call, I guess, experiential knowledge, which I guess in dance music is a big thing, because we all experience it going out and dancing, and we have this I guess, connection to the music and the social situation and the people that maybe you don't have as much in terms of certain other types of music.
No, it was definitely...
But that's very difficult to explain and write about, isn't it? Because it's deeply personal. It's like, I think I've only ever read maybe 2 descriptions, I think, of the experience of taking ecstasy that are any good. One of those was in Altered State, by Matthew Collin, and the other one actually was in Harry's recent book, Dreaming in Yellow, which is the story of DIY sound system, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, incredible book. I love that one. I actually purchased The Altered State, which is next up for me to read. Just on a very quick side topic, I'll mention it. I bought The Secret DJ, but I wasn't really feeling that. I put it there and I didn't get anywhere through that afterwards. But yeah, someone was saying...
His second book or the first one?
The very first one.
Okay. Fair enough. That's the thing. Not everybody is going to.
It was actually, you know what? You know why? I actually looked. I thought, this sounds interesting. Who is it? And then when I found out who it was, I thought, I don't know him. I don't care anymore.
I'll say who it was. I mean, I'll say it's a closely guarded secret. I think I know. But even
it's widely known. Even though if you look into
he was well, I mean, we communicate sometimes about different things. In fact, after he read Join the Future, he went. Basically, I've had to rewrite a load of my second book because of what you've done. Because I was going to talk about all this stuff, and I was like, sorry. He said, no, you've done a better job than I would have done. I was like,
it's great. So,
sorry, I've ruined it for you.
Someone on YouTube, Front Back House again, forgive me, I'm not sure who that is. They say Blackburn was seemingly a spot at the time. Now, I'm going to be talking at some point in the coming months to Rob Tessera, who was at one of those Blackburn raves. Most famously, I mean, he's still banging away on the scene, doing great guns. But he was actually one of the guys arrested at the Blackburn rave, wasn't he? Back in the day.
Yeah, I think he was. Wasn't there a famous story about he was arrested at the Gilderson rave, which is the one in West Yorkshire that the same people put on. And Gilderson was obviously mentioned in Join the Future. That was important because at the time, and it may still be, it was the largest mass arrest in British legal history. It was 800 and something, I can't remember the exact figure, people arrested. And the only person who was prosecuted was Rob Tessera, because he had something to do with, I guess he had something to do with organising it, or the sound system. He was the DJ. He was the one that got prosecuted. So do ask him about that. And actually, Rob is somebody that I should really talk to at some point as well, because he's got a lot of history and there's a lot of knowledge there. You know,
A hell of a lot.
if he ever wants to write a book, I'm sure we could find an outlet for him.
Wonderful. Writing books. Well, Prue just went on to Velocity and she said, I think it's sold out, mate. I can't get any. That's
wow. There you go. But yeah, well, that's why we need a new edition, isn't it? You see.
There you
But
go.
yeah,
So,
it is out there. There's other outlets. I mean, Velocity Press obviously is a better one to get it from, but yeah, it's to say it's been retypeset and whatever. But hey, it's Prue. I know Prue. I can always sort her out with a copy. It's not a problem.
oh, Danielson. Sorry, I didn't realise it. It's my friend Danny under a pseudonym logged in on YouTube that's been communicating with us. Okay, so I mentioned about Lenny Fontana, and I'll mention it quickly. I don't want to dwell on it, but I've also just started listening to an incredible podcast, Love is the Message, obviously following on from the book. And they go some incredible way to dissect the clubbing scene. They go back, they're even going back to, and I feel quite ignorant and embarrassed that I've spent so long in the music industry and there's so many layers to, you know, the culture that I was ignorant of. And this is very important, I think. I think you can be in the scene without really knowing, but when you do start to have the layers peeled back, you see things in a completely different way, right? Which is the importance, as you say, of documenting and doing journalism properly.
Yeah, and yeah, that's the thing. It's the more, you know, any sort of research project I've done, I suppose, I've gone into it with maybe knowing a little bit, but not that much, and being a bit fascinated by it, but also having some preconceived ideas that tend to be, once you get into it, actually discovering that what you thought was correct is wrong, or it's much more complicated than that. I mean, with the whole Bleep thing and Join the Future, it was a little bit like I kind of started at one point and it just thinking, right, it's going to be like this, and then it kind of went out like that. And then eventually you have all this material and you're trying to look at it and go, okay, what are the key threads here? These are the threads running through, and then look at those. So, for example, all the stuff about the Soul All Day scene, I kind of knew very little about that, apart from I'd read a book or two about Northern Soul, but I didn't know loads about it. And again, I thought I need to look more into this, so I went to RBMA and said, actually, there's an argument that the Soul All Day scene, and with the jazz, funk, and electro and everything that surrounded it, was actually the first kind of proper dance music boom, I guess, in the UK, because we forget how popular that was and how packed clubs were in that period of time. Now, it was a slightly different, there were different sides to it, because people like Chris Hill would get on the mic and do cheesy chat, and it was a little bit Radio 1 Roadshow, but with great Black American records, you know. But at the same time, there were also people in other parts of the country, you know, who were taking it a lot more seriously, and it didn't have that kind of cheesy vibe. So you wouldn't say that the events that Neil Rushton was putting on, for example, were like that at all, because, you know, most of the DJs he had on, I think, I mean, some might have got on the mic, but it was a lot more kind of a mixture of the purest Northern Soul and the kind of, I don't know what they would call it, modern soul, I suppose they'd have called it at that time, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and it's interesting as well when I have friends who were there back in the day, and they talk about that, you know, certain records actually, the changing of the guard, I use that phrase a lot, certain records would get booed by certain, in the Northern Soul scene, for example, they would get booed because, no, this isn't the way that our scene's meant to be going. You know, we want to keep it this sound, and that people trying to bring in the more contemporary sound, which was frowned upon. So you mentioned about the All Dayers. That's what led me to reach out to you and thank you, because for so long I had these memories of the name Jive Turkey in the back of my head that I knew I had been to, but I couldn't ever remember being there. I couldn't remember where it was, and your book went into great detail to document that, and how, you know, that kind of straddled the scenes, so to speak, from before the scene. And then also, I've since spoken to people on this show who have said that, you know, the rave culture was basically the death of the all dayer scene.
Yeah, it was. I mean, that's the point. Just a nice ad. There's an just to put it in here at this point. There's the Join the Future radio show that I do every month on Nudes here in Bristol, which you can get online as well. There's an episode of that, which is basically a conversation between Winston Hazel and myself, me obviously asking Winston questions, where we're talking about this very subject in terms of the kind of what happened and the sort of the impact of people that were dancers and were within that scene, and then going on to sort of make important records or be DJs or whatever later on down the line. And he made the point in that was actually recorded at We Out Here Festival last year, in the Talks tent there, and he talked in there about how that it was kind of the death knell of the scene. There were other stories as well that there's something that Parrott says a lot about Manchester, and I think I don't know whether Luke Una necessarily agrees with it a bit, but the Hacienda originally, people forget that the bedrock of the Hacienda in the early years, before the kind of, I guess, 88, were black foot workers and proper jazz dancers. They were given membership cards and they were there week in, week out. That's why if you listen to, like, say, Quando Quango or Tico records made by Mike Picking and people like that, they're really Latin influenced, aren't they? Because those guys liked Latin jazz. So, yeah, but again, they were sort of maybe not chased off the dance floor a bit, but they found, as soon as a load of white students turned up at the Hacienda, pilled up, it was all changed, because, they didn't really have the space to dance. It wasn't really, people like Winston, had been dancers, so they played in part for the dancers, but their crowds changed. Some of the dancers embraced house when it came along. And that's talked about in the book, but some didn't. Some felt a bit alienated by it, I think. I mean, I can't speak for them. I wasn't a dancer. I wasn't there at that point.
I had Tom Wainwright on a few weeks ago, and he was telling us about this, the story of the Hacienda, from how he happened upon his residency there, and he told about those tales. Jonathan came on and also told about some of the events that he was doing there. So there are so many different angles, so many different aspects, and there are so many reasons as well, as you say, which will lead me to another question. Looking back in hindsight, it is so very easy, as you say, to join the dots and to piece the information together. Is there a tendency sometimes? Can you, for example, spot where something is written maybe a little too romantically through rose-coloured spectacles? Does it stick out really obviously sometimes? I mean, you think that doesn't sound right to me.
Yeah, and I think as journalists, we're all kind of responsible for that a little bit. I mean, you could argue, and I think Edsy probably has made this point to me, that I maybe romanticised the story of the kind of the making of the original version of Only the Beginning of the Theme a little bit. I think it's kind of fundamentally accurate, but maybe presented in a way that makes it seem more like an origin story than maybe it was. But that's easy to say in hindsight. I think you do get a bit more, the more you do research and the more you look into the history and understand the history, you do get a bit more adept at kind of spotting, I guess, myth making, or what academics would call sort of narrative construction, or canonizing is the other one as well, isn't it? Where things are always presented as groundbreaking and the greatest examples of blah, blah, blah. Whereas actually a really terrible record that's really badly made could also be important in some way because it gave somebody an idea, or it was sampled for a particular record, or whatever.
You made a great point.
I suppose it is, I guess, easy to spot, but at the same time, unless you do the digging and the research, you just wouldn't know, would you? People tend to, if history is presented in such a way and you're told this is the truth, this is a fact, then you just kind of accept that. It's only if you know more, or you go out and do the digging yourself and find out more, that you can then go, well, actually, that's complete nonsense, or okay, that's partially true, but their importance has been overstressed, whatever.
Well, you mentioned earlier, looking back, I think it was you were saying the guys at LFO possibly, when they read their book and they say we were completely oblivious of everything that's going on around us at the time. We were too immersed in what we were doing. And I think that as well, the few books that I have read, podcasts that I've listened to, me being there from the early rave days, the way that the house music scene can sometimes be so heavily politicized, that it was this political movement of unrest of the youth of the country. And it's just like, well, to be fair, I was with a few thousand people and we were just going out and just getting on it every weekend,
That's the thing. It's easy to for some people it was political. So if you look at some people within the Free Party movement, not necessarily people who were just your average person that went to Castle Norton or went to a DIY or Spiral Tri-Party, who was, wasn't necessarily a Free Party regular, but just discovered this rave or found out it was going on and turned off, or a warehouse party or whatever. Some of the organisers of those events were deeply political, because they were kind of anarchists, weren't they? They were.
I was totally blown away.
People who believed that actually what they were doing was some kind of utopian ideal, and that they could change the world. And again,
the way Harry delivered that. Sorry to interrupt. The way Harry delivered his story in Dreaming of Yellow, which is another book that I would highly recommend. The way he delivered his story, there was no doubt of their aim, their beliefs, their goals, and how the story, developed. And as you say, I would have been one of those guys at Castle Morton. I would have been one of the guys at the Spiral Tri-Parties or whatever. Not really, as I just admitted, being none the wiser. But the political unrest in the country around that time, it was like the perfect storm, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of different things going on, and there were people with kind of different motivations. There were people who were, campaigning for particularly around when the Bright Bill was proposed. In 89, I think it was, and that came in July 1990, so 89, 90. And then the later Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, Bill/Act, which actually had a lot of other really nasty stuff in it that was nothing to do with dance music. I think that's important to point out. People think of it as this kind of anti-rave bill. It wasn't. The anti-rave stuff was just a part of a wider, really quite horrible authoritarian piece of legislation. So there were some people who were campaigning against that, who were anarchists. There were some who were ideologically driven. There were some that were just, anti-Tory. And there were some who were promoters who were looking at it from their commercial point of view. There's different perspectives of this. There are lots of people who say that Acid House was inherently political. Now, it's easy to say that now, but the vast majority of people I speak to, whether they're political now or not, when you talk to them about what they did at the time, taking aside the Free Party thing, in terms of people who were dancers, DJs, not necessarily promoters, some promoters, actually it wasn't about politics then, it was about having a good time and being excited by the music and being with mates and the drugs and all these kind of things that go with it. But for some other people, promoters, you Tony Colson haters of this world, it was a kind of an opportunity to make money. And that's why the Daily Mail's pet historian, who's a guy called Dominic Sambrook, in his book, which is called something to do with his cultural history of the UK over the last 100 years, or proper popular history from a Thatcherite perspective, he says in that that he believes that rave basically was a massively Thatcherite thing because, you know, it had these people like Tony Colson Hayter who were seizing an opportunity to make money, where, you know, which I would disagree with fundamentally, personally.
Completely.
But you would expect that perspective from him, isn't it? So people can interpret things in different ways and attach more meaning. I'll say more meaning because it was important to people at the time. And it's still, you know, I got accused, I guess, by one person who appears in the book but isn't interviewed, but did give me a lot of off-the-record sort of information. He just didn't want to be quoted in the book. He is quoted in there from another interview that he did. But he said, I don't want to do this because I think what you're doing is hollow nostalgia. And I said, well, how can it be hollow nostalgia when I wasn't there at the time? I didn't experience it. I'm just interested in that. I'm not coming at it from a nostalgic point of view of somebody who experienced that and is trying to relive their youth. So I did grow up in Sheffield, so I don't know whether that sort of, because there's something there maybe. Sort of Yorkshire chip on the shoulder, I think.
We have a comment. Andrew Milford again says, allegedly David Cameron was involved in the Sunrise raves. So
he was certainly. There's footage, isn't there, online somewhere that really looks like him. So it might be.
Oh, that's probably where the rumours have spread from.
I mean, you would expect that. A lot of people who are or have been top politicians will have done stuff like that in their youth. It's just that they don't talk about them, and to talk about them now would possibly undermine their hypocritical.
I was going to say credibility.
Anti-drugs. Anyway, we won't say who, but you know there's lots of rumours.
Yeah, let's
leave it at that to not be sued. You know.
Okay, well, as I did say when we began, before we came on air, I could quite easily sit chatting with you all evening, talking about the state of dance music, talking about the historical content within the book. Let's take another sweeping resume of the book in what it actually achieves from start to finish.
What does it achieve? That's a difficult one. It kind of starts the introduction. Well, there's a foreword by JD Twitch, I should add as well. So it's a thanks to Keith Twitch for doing that. But basically, it sort of starts. Well, actually, starts in 2018, doesn't it? In the introduction, with me being at a boiler room event. In Sheffield, actually, at a warehouse there where Winston was playing alongside George Evelyn from Night Nails on Wax, and I think Neil Landstrom played as well, and a few others, and sort of using that as a way of sort of talking about how your sort of Bleep records still sounded amazing and far-sighted, and how it kind of come back round again, because it had, you know, everybody, dance music has always been sort of cyclical, hasn't it, in terms of there's always this kind of, you're looking back 20 or 30 years into history. So now we're getting sort of early records that sound like sort of early trance, you know, and sort of breakbeaty stuff, or, you know, hardcore, whatever. But then from that point, it then kind of goes back to the sort of the politics and society and sort of environment of Yorkshire in particular during the late 70s and early 80s. And then basically there's a section talking about kind of the all days and electro and the changing club scene in Yorkshire and the Midlands. The various other things to set up then what happened next, which is the going from sort of tracing in however many chapters it is, the kind of very rapid development of Bleep and bass as a framework to talk about all these other different things that were happening. So what was happening in the Midlands, what's happening in the East Midlands, what's happening in Birmingham, you know, and then once we've dealt with the Midlands and the North, then we go a bit further down south, we go to sort of Luton and Bedford around there, and what was happening there. Because again, that was something that I didn't really know much about, and when I found out about all that stuff, I thought, this is great, this is brilliant, this is, why do we not talk about this? This is, you know, and all the things we can learn from that. And then kind of how Bleep then kind of merged with what was happening down south in terms of the more breakbeat side of things, from rare groove to sort of become part of the breakbeat hardcore sound that later turned into darkcore and jungle. And then we finish with a kind of appraisal, I guess, of what Bleep meant and what we've learned from that. And in that chapter, there's actually quite a few comments from sort of younger DJs and producers in Sheffield, and actually all the stuff that's said in that chapter about me kind of sort of almost not meeting these people randomly. I was contacted by one who wanted to talk to me for something he was doing about Bleep, because he'd heard that I'd been doing X, Y, and Z. But I also ended up just wandering into this gallery at Park Hill where the sort of famous block of flats in the centre of Sheffield, and there's a gallery there called, I think, S1 Art Space, something like that, and started talking to the people who sort of worked there, and they were talking about how they were really interested in the history of what had happened in Sheffield in terms of the sort of musical history and the bass music culture and where that came from, and the people that came before them, but they didn't really know an awful lot about it, but they had made the connections themselves, which I found really interesting, because this was actually a perfect example of, and a perfect way to end the book, I suppose, in that it's not just me that's noticed this or saying this. It's kind of other people. It's just not an argument that, for whatever reason, had been put forward before, and I don't really know why. It seemed throughout the course of the time I was researching and writing the book, it seemed quite obvious, but I don't know. I'm biased, aren't I? I'm from Sheffield. I'm from Yorkshire. But it is important to note that I don't just talk about Sheffield. In fact, there's probably more about Leeds in the book than there is about Sheffield, arguably, or just as much anyway.
Takes us through the ages, well into the 2000s as well. Tell us about the general reviews from your peers, how the book was received generally.
Yeah, I mean, it got. I wouldn't say necessarily surprised. It's really hard to judge your own work. Whether you're I say a producer because I'm not a music producer, but I could make something and go, wow, that sounds good, but you go, oh my god, that's awful. It's really badly produced. And it's the same as a writer. It's really hard to judge your own work. So when you start getting people saying, I've read it, it's great. I mean, the first feedback I actually got was from Martin James, who wrote State of Bass, who's now my director of studies actually at Solent University and the PhD that I'm doing. And that was at an event called Louder Than Words in Manchester. And I'd gone up there with Colin, and I'd never met Martin before, didn't know he'd read it. And he said, yeah, I've read it. It's brilliant. It's fantastic. It's so detailed. He said, you've done more work than a PhD student would have done. I went, what? That's funny. I've been thinking maybe that I should have been trying to do a PhD with this while I was researching it. Maybe I should do that. And he said, yeah, you should. When you're ready to do it, come and talk to me, which obviously I did. So that was good. There were some really positive reviews. I mean, my old editor at IDJ, Russell Deeks, who I have a lot of respect for, who's a really good journalist, very knowledgeable. He said to me after he'd read it, he was sort of blown away. He said he thought it was one of the best books he'd ever read about music and dance music in particular, which I was like, it's a guy who's read a lot of books about music, so that's good. And then ending up being named by Rolling Stone UK as one of the best books about British music culture, alongside things like England's Dreaming by John Savage, which is a kind of, a classic book about punk. And I just couldn't believe that. That's mad. But
wow.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I'm glad that people have enjoyed it and they find it. One of the things that I think is almost the best feedback you can get really is when people say, I learned a lot, but it's a page turner, And it's just because, again, history is really messy, and it took me a long time to work out what the structure would be and how I would arrange it and tell these stories in such a way that there was still a narrative arc while also going off in different directions. Because you'll notice in some chapters, one chapter I might be talking about stuff that happened in between 1988 and 90, and then the next chapter it might go 90 to 93 and then back again, because there's just not an easy way of doing it as a linear chronological history when there's so many different things happening at once. But yeah, I was obviously blown away by the feedback.
It all ties together so perfectly.
Thank
you. Reading it and paying attention is definitely something that will, you've left your legacy with this book without a shadow of a doubt.
Well, I have to say I hope I've not peaked, because there are other books coming down the line, and I get ideas for books all the time. I don't think there's necessarily enough time to look at them, and obviously I've got the research project that I'm doing for the PhD, which may or may not be a book, and that is a sort of slightly different thing. But again, that's into, like I said, I was looking at East Anglia, and that actually came from being asked to do an online lecture actually about it, which you can find online, which the Assembly House Trust in Norwich asked me to do. Again, that was on the back of Joy in the Future. That's called Storm from the East, is the name of the after the 1996 compilation on Moving Shadow, the same name.
You talk about compilation. You have something there to show me.
Oh yes, this is as everybody will see. I can't do the wrong way around. There you go. Let's read it. But yeah, this is Joy in the Future, UK Bleep and Bass, 88 to 91. I think it says originally it was going to be 92, I think, or 93 or something. But yeah, that's the back. It's basically on Cease and Desist. Came out in March 2020. There was a new pressing earlier this year as well, because the first one sold out. And yeah, that's basically, it ties into the book. So there's some stuff featuring the book. There's a couple of unreleased tracks on there. There's one from Rob Gordon produced by a guy called Alfonso, called Dub Feels Nice, which has this really bizarre history in that it came out, never officially came out, but it was pressed up, if that makes sense. So he pressed it up. I think he got a box or a couple of boxes that got taken down to various record shops in Sheffield, and then the distributor went down. So there's probably only about 40 or 50 copies or something that exist. The version that we've got on there is a completely unreleased mix, actually, that you managed to find on a DAT. And there's the original version of Joy in the Future by Tough Little Unit, which is important for me to get on there. And the original version had no vocals, so that's the vocal-free version. And then there's some historic stuff. So Where in the Beginning by Unique 3 and the Mad Musician is on there. And I tried with that to represent kind of important people. Like, it was really important for me to have something related to DJ Martin on there. I think Martin is probably certainly the person that inspired me the most of the interviewees, I think, of the people that I talked to for the book, because he was incredibly gracious with his time with me, but he had this history back in the day of just kind of helping people, just helping all of these local guys in Chapeltown to make records. Didn't bother getting any credit for it because he didn't really care. He just liked doing it. And then he sort of continued that later, working with boxers, both amateur and professional, sort of getting people kind of off the streets and giving them a chance. So he was a really inspirational guy who was involved in some really important records. Now, he doesn't care that people don't know who he is or we didn't get any credit, because it's not, his attitude is, well, I did it and I moved on. Whereas I go, yeah, but you know, without you, LFO wouldn't have been made, and it wouldn't have been made in the way it was made. You know, you were the DJ, you arranged it for the dance floor. As amazing as those guys and talented as those guys were, and as fantastic as some of the records they subsequently made were, they would not have made that record in that way without you. So that inspires me. I've gone off rambling again, haven't I? I'm sorry.
It's fine, mate. It's fine. I'm going to start.
It's enthusiastic rambling.
That's great. We love it. I'm going to start wrapping up in a little bit, but that's all good. I'm happy to sit here. I don't know what point he's making, but Andrew says, your album is £33, including shipping on Discogs. That doesn't sound like he's happy about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't say.
Is it a double pack?
It is. It's a double album. it's a double album pressed with extensive sleeve notes, as you'd expect from me, basically talking about the stories of the different tracks and the kind of why Bleep is important, which again is you get obviously in the book, but it's a bit shorter. It is available for those who don't do vinyl or don't want to spend that amount, which is fair enough because we're all fairly, cost of living, everything's going up, it's expensive. It can be streamed, so it's on all of the usual streaming services. You can get it from the download places. Beatport will have it, Juno downloads, and of course Bandcamp. There's a cease and desist Bandcamp. Which you can get on as well.
So you mentioned about the podcast with the recording of yourself and Winstall at We Out Here Festival. Please reconfirm the URL of that, where people can find your monthly podcast.
It's the final Wednesday, I think, of every month at 3 p.m. it goes out, but you can always find them online. There's an audio section of the Join the Future website, which is jointhefuture.net. Had to be .net because that's pretty 90s, isn't it? That sounds pretty old school and sounded futuristic at the time. And also, I think jointhefuture.com wasn't available. But yeah,
my website's .net. My website's .net.
Oh yeah, that's great. So jointhefuture.net, and that has the other, obviously, has the stuff about the book, and that has the links to the monthly radio show. The radio shows aren't all necessarily about history. Some of them are. So this year there's been an interview, like an in conversation, bit like this, but with music, with Jordan GCZ of Juju and Jordash fame. There's been a 2-part history of bassline, the sort of another sort of Midlands northern sounds. There's a bit more garage, which again, that's not necessarily I probably own about 3 bassline records, but again, I think that's a really interesting story, really vibrant musical community. There's also Russell Deeks' first ever article on Bassline House from 2004. You can also read again on the website, and links to the radio shows and various other articles. Oh, and the next show, which is the later this month, is my interview with Ron Trent. Trent,
wonderful.
Who was he's a really inspirational guy to speak to, actually. It seemed like a lovely fella, and
in the nicest possible way. In the nicest possible way, one of the biggest nerds you'll ever get to talk to.
Oh yeah, he's very nerdy about sound, isn't he? And and sort of and production and things like that. And again, I didn't really ask him that much about those things because I'm not. I'm sort of a production nerd in that I kind of know all of the instruments. I think now that are on various Bleep records, in part because people like Rob Gordon would absolutely love telling me about that. Like, oh, this has got this X, Y, and Z. I go. And I had somebody who did say to me that they're a bit disappointed that there wasn't more about the kit used in the book. And I thought, well,
that's a whole nother book.
That's a whole other book. I mean, there's probably an article on that. I mean, I think you could do a kind of a presentation in some way about, do that thing. There's a guy, isn't there, on YouTube that's famous, a guitarist for deconstructing songs. And he sits in his studio and goes, "This is how they made, I don't know, a Tears for Fears record."
I know a few people that a good friend of ours, Sunlight Square, does a lot of that as well.
Yeah.
But listen, let me go to the chat. Delhi has still been watching and listening all the way through, so big up Delhi. Delhi, we've had on chatting before. Yourself, I would love to bring back on and interspersed with other of our guests because I think it would be an enthralling conversation. Andrew Milford said, "I've spent 40 quid tonight watching this." He got a copy of the album for £28. He said, I've spent 40 quid tonight. I'm not coming here again."
Well, it was all the music on the album as well was remastered as well by Rob Gordon, who's a key figure in the Bleep story and just has the most insane ears. So he's made the tracks that previously sounded a bit weak, he's made them sound really bass heavy. Because that's the thing, actually, about Bleep. Sorry to go back to that. But not all of the records necessarily sounded as heavy first time round as they should have done, because only a few I mean, only a few people know how to kind of get the bass that weighty. And at the time, it was quite, it was something that nobody had pushed.
Well, some of the stories in the book about how when they were records were going to be pressed, and some of the methods that they unorthodox methods that they tried, it made me chuckle. As being in a pressing plant on several occasions, it did make me chuckle.
Oh yeah,
but listen,
and again, some of those stories I think about, people writing in because the theme blew speakers and so on. I don't really know how true they are. Edsy and sort of mentioned this to me, and it may well be true. I've no idea, but whether it's true or not, it's the kind of thing that you kind of think would be true, and I think that's the sort of the problem. Sometimes, you're
getting into dodgy territory there, though. You're getting into dodgy territory.
Sometimes things aren't true, but they sound like they should be true, and I think that's, like you say, it's a dodgy territory. It's a big problem. But again. As long as you're not saying that definitely happened, if you're saying this person says that this happens, then you're that's the history in your cupboard, I think. You're not making a judgment on that. But that's why if you're doing journalistic, my way from that.
My way of tying all of this together is by saying one thing that is true is that this book is incredible. We've had a few people already saying they've been out and got it. I'm happy to have been able to chat to you this evening to document and find out a little bit more about yourself, find out more about your journey.
Thank you for having me on, Andy. It's been great.
It's been beautiful. And thank you for giving me a little bit more inspiration to do a little bit more research into my conversations, although a little bit is really the word that I use, little. A little bit.
But the thing is, what you've got to remember, and because you know this, you speak to people and you get, great history from them. Doing a lot of research is very time consuming. That's the thing. Not everybody has the time to do it. I've been lucky that I've managed to sort of, I wouldn't say make a living out of it, because I still have to do other things. You know what it's like if you're a freelancer. I still have to do other things to earn a living. But I'm in a fortunate position that I can do that. Not everybody can, but any attempts that anybody makes, I think, to document musical history, and particularly what we'd call hidden histories, things that haven't been talked about a lot, that's great. It doesn't matter whether you're a professional or not. If you're doing that and you have the passion for doing it, that should be celebrated. And people like us, whether we're professionals or not, should be supporting those people to do those things, I think.
Wonderful.
Document your own culture, basically, as Emma Warren would say.
Wonderful.
And keep doing that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I am going to leave you to the rest of your Tuesday now. People are saying thank you inside the chat. You'll be able to come back and read all of the comments later on. And
we will also say if anybody ever wants any more info or advice, if they've got in terms of like a project where they want to do research or document culture, or they've got an idea that they want to develop or anything like that, I'm always happy to kind of answer emails and things from people. hello@jointhefuture.net is the email address, and I'll always try and help and encourage people where I can.
Matt, thank you so much. jointhefuture.net once again. My friend, I'll drop you a message later. Bye-bye.
Yeah, speak to you soon. Cheers.
Take care. Okay, guys, as you heard, Matt, a fountain of knowledge, and I could quite easily sat here talking with him all evening. Thank you to everyone that has been commenting throughout. Thank you. I see you all here from start to finish, and so many of you will come back and check out this recording. Now, I do these every Tuesday evening, just stating the obvious for anybody that may be catching this for the first time. Live on Facebook on my Andy Wood profile. We also have a dedicated page, Inspire and Be Inspired. We can see people here on the screen who have followed the page today. Mr. Kevin Harper, Dave Gould, my friend from Croatia, Tomislav, Denny, Rachel, Justin, John, Alex, all liking from all different parts from Europe and beyond. Thank you all. Also, of course, archived on YouTube. So if you have happened upon this video as the first you've seen of these talks, then I do highly recommend you go back and check out some of the other fantastic conversations I've been having from some of my friends from Birmingham, Manchester, Nottingham, Leeds and beyond. Thank you so much for your time. You can catch all of the podcasts on Spotify, and also take a look at djandyward.net to find out lots more. My friend Dave Furs jumps on as I'm about to say goodbye and says, hello, everyone. You gotta love it. Dave, catch the recording. Right, that's me done, guys. Respect. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Matt. Big up to Velocity Press. That's all I can say. Take care. You take care now.